Welcome, folks. Welcome. I can see that there are folks starting to join our conversation today. The webinar that we'll be hosting today, Funding Movement Building in New Mexico. Really honored to have Adrián Pedroza, Gabrielle Uballez, Rael, and Marisa Magallanez for today's conversation. Well, I think we've got a good group of folks in the house, and so we're going to go ahead and get started because we've got quite a full schedule today, and really just excited about this conversation. Once again, my name is Alicia Lueras, Maldonado. I work with the Building Movement Project. I am based here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and have been doing the work with Building Movement Project since they started working in New Mexico almost 10 years ago. So it's been quite a journey, and really excited to have started this webinar series that we've been doing. So again, thank you all for coming. I'm going to move ahead to some logistics for you all. So just so folks know, attendees are not visible, but as you're doing very well, use the Q&A feature, use the chat if you've got any tech issues. This webinar is being recorded, and after today's conversation, we'll share the link along with additional materials that you all can take a look at or share with your friends and colleagues who might not have been able to join us today. Also, please tweet Move the Money at Building Movement Project. It'd be great to get the word out about what we're doing and share these resources with more folks than are on the panel today. Before we get to our conversation with our panelists, I wanted to share a little bit about the work that Building Movement Project does. We're a national organization. As I mentioned earlier, I do work here in New Mexico specifically, but the organization is a national organization that develops research, tools, training, and opportunities for partnership to both nonprofit organizations and to the sector to really support the voice and power of the people that they serve. Since being founded over 20 years ago, Building Movement Project has focused on three main areas: movement building, leadership, and service and social change. Through the movement building and the transformational solidarity line of work, we do help organizations and movements work collectively to build a bigger impact than they might be able to do on their own. And so what we're focusing on today is the Move the Money Toolkit, which is really geared towards philanthropy. And that's what the nature of our conversation will be focused on for today. For service and social change, we work with direct service organizations to help them embrace social change values and practices and really tap into the voice and power of their constituencies and clients. Our leadership work includes research and study, generational shifts, leadership transition, and for the past few years, we've been doing focus on racial gaps, and in particular, the Race to Lead initiatives. And some of you may have participated in some of the surveys that we've done in the past as well. So for today, the goals of our webinar, we really want to introduce the work of Move the Money. We want to hear from foundation and movement leaders who we have with us today, and really equip philanthropy with the tools to support movements and movement leaders. I'm going to take a few minutes now to introduce our panelists. I told all of them that I was really honored that they all said yes when I asked if they could be a part of today's conversation. We have Adrián Pedroza. He's the National Executive Director of Abriendo, Puertas, Opening Doors. It's the nation's first evidence-based comprehensive training program developed by and for Latino parents with children ages 0 to 5. Previously, before he was working with Abriendo Puertas, he dedicated 10 years of his career as the executive director of the social enterprise director at the Partnership for Community Action. And this was where I first met Adrián when he was doing that work. And so it's been a real pleasure to see his growth in the sector and the work that he continues to do. Our next panelist is Gabrielle Uballez. She's the Southwest Regional Program Officer for the Asset Funders Network, where she contributes to the National Racial and Economic Justice Programming and Philanthropy and leads regional efforts towards collective action to achieve economic justice and dignity for all New Mexicans. She also has done a great deal of work with the New Mexico Women of Color Nonprofit Leadership Initiative as part of the Santa Fe Community Foundation. And as just a general amazing young woman and mother of three, I know Gabrielle personally as well, and just really honored that in spite of the busy schedule and the work that she's doing, that she made the time today. So thank you, Gabrielle. We have Rael joining us. He's the Director of Strategy and Initiatives at the McCune Charitable Foundation. He brings almost 20 years of entrepreneurial experience across a broad range of industries, from more than 10 years experience in grassroots community and enterprise development to the foundation. He began his work at the McCune Charitable Foundation as a program officer in 2012, and really continues to push this work forward as a strategist and driving initiatives for the foundation. So thank you, Henry, who also I've known for a very long time. Feel really honored that you're taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Marisa Magallanez is joining us from the Albuquerque Community Foundation. She is someone that I'm getting to know more recently, and just really such a pleasure to have you here with us today. She serves as the Vice President of Strategy and Equity. She has a background in arts administration and over 15 years of experience in agile, resilient, and community-centered organizations. So we're really honored to have all four of you here with us today for this conversation. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Move the Money toolkit, and then we are going to get into a conversation with our panelists. So the Move the Money toolkit was developed by, again, the Building Movement Project over the course of 2 years, and it was holding webinars on social change movements, conversations with movement leaders, creating a movement leadership learning lab, and paired dialogues with movement leaders and funders. And all of this work started coming through during the uprisings against anti-Black racism, the elections, the pandemic. All of these things were starting to unfold in 2020. And these conversations really touched on the role of philanthropy and how they could be supporting these movements. And so a year later, as we were in the midst of these great social movements that were still trying to seek systemic cultural and policy change on a range of issues. And so these engagements really led to the creation of the Move the Money toolkit, and are really geared towards philanthropy to support and sustain social movements. And what you're seeing on the right of this is one of the guides. If you go to the Move the Money website, it's accompanied by video interviews, and then each one has a guide that has reflections and questions for folks to think about. And so these are tools that folks can take and use in their own conversations. So that's a little bit of background around the conversation that we are looking forward to having today. And I wanted to start with a question for Adrián Pedroza. And having worked for many years as a movement leader, what would you say has been effective in your work, and what are the barriers? What does it take to get funders to listen? What does it take to get this work moving?
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you to the Building Movement Project for inviting us. Great to see so many friends and partners on this webinar and here on this panel. That's a big question, right? Because I think I feel like I'm always learning, I'm always developing as a leader, as a community member. But I've definitely taken some lessons, learned some lessons over the years about investment and really partnership, right, with funders. One thing that's key, I think, over the years that I've learned is that, when I started seeing funders as partners in this work, that it really shifted the way I interacted with them, even from the get-go, right from the beginning, as we were kind of proposing, right, a scope of work, a mission, a vision, a capital project. And I think, at times, as with any partnership, right, you sometimes say no, this partnership has to part ways. and hopefully, more times than none, you say yes, right, and you agree that it's a mutually beneficial relationship that's going to move a mission forward, right, and that has an end purpose. I think that over the years in doing this work, it's become very evident that relationships matter, and when I see relationships, I know we all work on them on a daily basis, but I mean it in a very intentional way, right? Really, that our funding partners, I've learned, have to know the leaders of the organization, the members of the organization, in a way that not just gets to know their work, but also the why of why we do the work that we do, our maybe even personal stories, what got us to this place, why we choose to do social impact work. And I think that it's important because in many situations, it's the program officer, it's those we're interacting with that have to go to bat for us, right, and have to make the case for the projects that we're proposing. And when they get to know our why and our stories more, then I believe that they're more able to advocate for what we're proposing, to their board, to their to their organizational leaders. And so relationships obviously matter deeply. Now over the years, I've learned that that's not always enough, right? That somebody could believe in your cause and want to fund and want to engage in a partnership on a particular project, but that really us as leaders have to ensure that we sort of have our organizational structures and our financials and the different pieces in place in order for a funder to be able to really make a case. And so one thing I learned deeply in engaging really around a capital raise project, that's a social enterprise center here in the South Valley that I'm actually sitting in. We'll have a grand opening here that I'm sure everyone here is going to be invited to. But this raise started about 6 years ago, and with investments from Marisa's organization here, the Community Foundation and McCune Foundation and Kellogg and many EDA, Santa Fe Community Foundation. But it was really a coming together of many funders. But one thing I learned quickly, although we had a great vision and a sort of pitch, if you will, that we were being asked for things that we hadn't been asked for before, like pro formas and projections of revenue, and things that were uncomfortable to us, because as a nonprofit, many times we don't think about some of those deeper kind of financial types of presentations, and so we quickly learned that we needed to partner with the right people in order to produce some of these things. Even though we were a sound financial organization, we knew we had to be able to help our funding partners to really make the case, right, and to show that this was a viable project that was going to be meaningful and have an impact with our South Valley community and beyond. So I learned many things. I'll stop there because I think I'm at my 4 minutes, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Alicia.
Yeah, Adrián, thank you for sharing some of that. And we're going to watch a short video after that, but a couple of the things that you raised, I think we can come back to after we watch this video. But really, partnerships, relationships, funders knowing the leadership of who they're funding and their story, like why they're there, were three things that really stood out for me. And so I want to get back to those. What we're going to do now is watch one of the 4 videos from the Move the Money toolkit. And it's about 4 minutes long. And then we're going to come back and then spend the rest of the time really getting into this conversation with the rest of our panelists. But thank you so much, Adrián, for sharing some of that experience and sort of the longevity of thinking that you had to go through as you sort of made your way to where you are now. So hold tight. We're going to watch a video, and then we'll be back.
Our role is really to unlock as many resources as we can for progressive, radical organizing, intersectional organizing, and power building work.
A lot of times when we talk about risk in philanthropy, what we really mean is control. That has to be interrogated. What is the real risk? It's possible that we will look foolish, that the goals that we might have thought would be achieved won't be achieved. But what we don't really talk about is the risk of not doing something. And that's really the biggest risk that philanthropy is falling prey to all of the time. If we don't invest in these organizations right now, what will this country look like in 10 and 20 years?
You're sitting there with proximity to the levers of power and decision making and all this money and a relationship with communities that need it. Why would you not use your positional power to pull that lever down as hard as you can? And I think that there's a politeness and all of this stuff in philanthropy that's part of white supremacy culture and capitalist culture that talks people out of doing that. But these are all ways in which the system is rigged. So we have a responsibility as part of our job to unrig the system.
It's hard to actually imagine a situation in which a strategy would be successful for people who are most impacted by whatever injustice you're trying to solve. Like if that strategy came out of a foundation, like that's just really hard for me to imagine, even though that is like, I think what the operating assumption is.
We support the vision you have as leaders in this movement, and we trust that you know how to spend that money. We're not going to tell you that it should be this for this particular project, for this particular campaign, because you know what those campaigns are and what campaigns require what kind of money and what kind of timeline, and that those timelines could change.
Because we talk to other grant makers all day, we have a sense of what they're interested in and how they listen, and so we can pitch the work that we're raising money for in different ways. It's part of our self-evaluation. How much work have you done in addition to your grant maker role to help your grantees, to help the field?
There's got to be acknowledgement that if we're going to achieve systemic change, we've got to reshuffle the power dynamics. We've got to be organizers in our sector and think like organizers to really try to beef up the resources that are available to groups.
Just like there is institutionalized racism within philanthropy, there is actually anti-Muslim bigotry that has been sort of foundational within the philanthropy system and many other systems. So part of the work that we do is having those conversations. We actually brought in another grantee partner, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, to do an anti-Muslim bias and anti-racism bias within philanthropy training to really understand kind of how anti-Black and anti-Muslim racism are intertwined and how that actually shows up within institutional philanthropy.
I think a lot of folks in philanthropy think that the job is to stand on high and sprinkle resources down. If we are collectively building a beloved community, then we have to be in relationship with each other. Too often, what philanthropy does is create distance. And what we need to be doing is actually thinking about how we come together more closely.
If you think about the things that have always changed the world, and you just look out your window and see like what is happening at this very moment in time in our country's history, in the world's history, it is movements that have done that, and flipping it, that it is actually risky to not fund movement building.
Thank you for sharing that, Catherine, which reminds me that I did not introduce our wonderful Catherine Foley, who is behind the screen that says BMP admin. She's been instrumental in helping me put together this webinar. So thanks, Catherine, for being there and queuing up that video. I just put in the chat for our attendees, if at any point you want to use the Q&A function, or even just write a question directly into the chat, please feel free to do that. We're going to have some time for Q&A for our panelists towards the end of the webinar. So if you've got a question that's burning, just put it in there, and we're going to try to get to some of those questions in a little bit here. So Gabrielle, I wanted to turn to you and ask you a little bit, one, in terms of just your reaction to what you saw in the video, but then, the work that you do as a funder strategist, and, what what are you seeing and what are you advising and what do funders need to do in your thoughts in terms of the needs that were referenced, and thinking back again to, to relationship, to the risk that might be taken versus control, right? And sort of those things that happen. So I'd like to hear from you about sort of the initiatives that you're helping to lead, and how that translates into policy change for yourself and for the work you do.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, the line that really hooked me in that video was, what's the risk of not doing something? I think that as funders and program officers, right, you're not just accountable to the people doing the movement work on the ground or the direct services on the ground, you're accountable to a board who might be risk adverse. And I think one of the challenges, we face, and that I'm like game for all the way, is how do we start to ask that question? If we don't do this now, even if it's not perfect, what will happen later as a result of that, or what won't happen? Because we have a limited amount of time to make some of these policy issues happen. So I think redefining risk is one of the biggest things we can do. I think also a lot of this is related to a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, racial justice work that philanthropy has called out through statements of solidarity after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the racial uprisings. And I think there's, I've seen quite a bit of hesitancy to get that work started and learn as we go, rather than to have it perfect and just do it. I would say jump into it. So I think risk taking is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the sector, both in my work at Asset Funders Network, but also as a consultant doing some DEI work within philanthropy. The other thing that I'm really curious about is ecosystems. And so questioning and really asking funders to think about not just funding organizations, but funding ecosystems of organizations. So really understanding what kind of coalitions already exist around movement building, but also around this combination of direct service and systems change. Have been really inspired by the resource you all have provided. I saw it come out and I was like, yes, another toolkit, because I think we need to layer them on each other. Movement building is I think one of the bigger frontiers philanthropy can step into, but also this idea of, some of you may have been familiar with it, this idea of community-centric fundraising, and what does that mean for community-centric grant making? So understanding that it's not just about funding organizations, but it's about funding organizations, initiatives, and leaders within coalitions to make change happen. And then the second to last thing I'll say about this is I have a lot of curiosity about how funders make the leap from direct service and Band-Aids to movement work and policy advocacy work, and funding those things in a thoughtful way. And it's not all or nothing. We need the direct services while we're also doing the systems change. And one of the things we talked about in AFN's 2021 brief From Relief to Resilience, Reimagining Reinvestments, was the importance of balancing short-term needs with long-term gains, and for funders to really understand who and what we're funding within the ecosystem, and how do we fill those gaps and work with other funders to address that both and, right? The what is needed now to help people survive, but also what do we need to change in systems to make sure that everyone thrives long-term. And then my last point, and I'm really excited to be in the room, especially with everyone, Adrián included, but Henry and Marisa, because I really see my role as an organizer within the sector of philanthropy. And so right, there's movement building and organizers who are doing the policy advocacy work, but also we can be organizers within our sector to get funders to buy into investing in new and innovative ways and systems change, and thinking about how we lead and organize ourselves and find common ground among many different issue areas and mission statements to have meaningful impact that really is led by the Black and Brown and Indigenous people doing the systems change work on the ground. So yeah, those are my high level thoughts on how we as funders can be, or funder like adjacent folks like myself can change how we're thinking and acting to organize around movement building.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for sharing those thoughts. It made me think of, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman in the video, but he's like, we got to be organizers in fundraising, right? And so I think that's such a critical piece that there might have been a big disconnect for many years. And so I think the fact that you all are really investigating that and lifting that up gives me, I'm just like, yes, we need more of that. And, Laurel Wyckoff mentioned in the chat, that the philanthropic staff looks different, and it does, but we still see that there are lots of gaps within leadership roles in philanthropy. And so I wanted to, to shift it over to Henry and have you talk about your role as a funder, right? And so what does it look like, and what does it mean to actually shift power dynamics within not only a philanthropic institution, but in the way that you all fund and the groups that you fund, if you could share, and feel free you all to reflect on what each other is saying, and if you all have questions for each other, just raise your hand, and we can, doesn't have to be as formal, so feel free to reflect on what the other panelists are saying as well.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I think that the concept of being an organizer within the philanthropic sector is absolutely critical. So in terms of the question of like shifting power, I think the way that I think about that is really about, you aren't changing power unless you're changing who's making decisions. At the end of the day, if the same people are ultimately making the decisions, then power really hasn't shifted. So a lot of the work that, like at McCune, we've been really doing over the last several years is like figuring out how we could change the structure of our grant making so that we center community voice as much as possible. We've implemented things. I mean, a lot of you may be familiar with a movement called the trust-based philanthropy approach. There's an organization called the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And the principles that they're really sort of trying to promulgate through the sector and the institution of philanthropy are the things that anybody that works in the nonprofit sector is just going to roll their eyes and say, yeah, no duh. So, unrestricted funding, multi-year funding, how do we simplify reporting? What can the program officer do beyond just giving a check? These are basic things that, are completely make total sense, but it's slow going to get actually foundations to shift. I do think that in the time that I've been in philanthropy, which has been about 10 years, I think that there's definitely an increase in terms of awareness among funders. I think that there's funders who are definitely trying to adopt these practices, in deeper ways. But I think the real challenge, and this comes back to the point about organizing, is that no matter how much, for example, the McCune Foundation does to make our grant making as friendly as possible to nonprofits, we are just one funder. And, I don't think that there's a group in New Mexico that gets much more than, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of their budget from McCune every year. So, that's one hoop that's a little easier to jump through, but the whole issue is that there's so many hoops and each hoop is different. And so that just speaks to the importance. So a lot of the work that I've been focused on the last several years is just sort of the recognition that, first of all, philanthropy is not monolithic. Every foundation is different. And I think that at the staff level, I've encountered a lot more willingness to change and to try different things, and to sort of recognize that foundations have to change from the bottom all the way to the top. So as much as your program officer or even the executive director might be on board with certain things, it's still a whole institutional change that has to happen in terms of the board and whatever hesitancy the board has or whatever fears they may have. So the approach that we've really been focused on, I think locally, a number of funders have been collaborating on this concept of zone grants, of the idea of like, how do we create structures that can sort of sit on top of philanthropy and allow this kind of funding and grant making in a way that foundations don't have to fundamentally change who they are or what they are, but that they can pull money in ways that allows it to kind of move in a more constructive, in a more constructive way. And so that's the sort of the big thing. Part of my private sector career, I worked in the semiconductor industry, and one of the things that I worked on a lot was on smartphones when they were first coming out. And if you think of the complexity of a smartphone and all of the individual components and the functions that it can do, and you think about as a user, like, how would I have a relationship with, messaging and with location and all these different things? How can I control all that? Well, you don't really have to control all that, because the software abstracts the complexity of all of that functionality, so you're able to interface with it really easily. And I think that's the kind of organizing that a lot of us have been trying to do, is each foundation, think of it as a very complex thing, and it has its own sort of way of doing things. How do we create a structure that sits on top of that can sort of abstract that complexity, so that on the front end, the end user, which is the movement builders themselves, the organizers, that it's much easier for them to interface with all of that complexity. So I think, that's sort of the theory that we've been going after, is like, how do we get decision-making into the hands of the people that are most, they're most directly impacted by and doing the work on the ground, and do it in such a way that doesn't require having to really intersect with the complete complexity of the whole system, but really just structures that interface with it. So yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Henry. I think that's a lot to think about, right? And I think one of the things that stood out for me, and I'm seeing it in the chat as well, and it came from our friend Hakeem Bellamy, who's like, yes, right. It makes no sense to have shifting staff or shifting leadership if they're just going to make the same decisions, right? And so I think that's super critical, and I'm going to segue to then talking to Marisa about your role, right? Coming as someone who has done years of work in community, but now finds yourself in a newer role within a foundation. And so I wanted to have you share with us a little bit about how you're approaching your role within the foundation, and sort of the work that you're doing to hopefully open some new doors, open some new ways of thinking. What's the transformational work that you're looking forward to doing within the foundation?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alicia. And thank you, everybody, for having me. I do recognize that I'm the new kid on the block in philanthropy, and have worked for a long time in a nonprofit. And of course, ACF is still, figuring out our space and our role as a community foundation to be a good partner in movement building work. And I also just want to acknowledge, the many people on the call here today and out in the community that are deep in movement building work. And thank you for all that you're doing in this community. I think, I was excited as Henry was talking about trust-based philanthropy and education of board and things like that, because I feel we're in the midst of that change. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of our external work in terms of our grant making, and really also loved in the video when they were talking about, like, how are we using all of our levers? And so we're thinking a lot about that at the community foundation, right? Grant making, our competitive grant program, which we also feel needs a big redesign and reimagining of, is one aspect, and maybe that's the way most people intersect with the community foundation. But what about our impact investments? What about our partnership with other foundations and philanthropy? What about our access to donors and their education and involvement in this whole process? And then what about our influence, and what are we willing to stand up for in this community and be in the middle of, the most complex issues as a community foundation? And so I think that's kind of just a high level summary of all the things that we're investigating at the community foundation, trying to make the shifts where we can with our discretionary dollars, and using those to strengthen our partners through leadership and coalition work, and then learning a lot with peers, right? So thinking about the work that Gabrielle's doing with asset funders, and being able to participate in, like, the zone grants with Henry and those folks. And then lots of folks on the call, from Robert to Magdalena to Christopher, that are walking this walk with us and helping to create and reimagine different ways for, the better deployment of funds, and standing up again and using our influence, which is, I think, probably the place that we've typically been pretty moderate and conservative about. And I'm really excited to see that change. The other thing I just want to point out quickly is, the internal work, because we can do all the external work we want, and that's really critical. But I feel like the foundation of cultural work inside, values aligned hiring, and making sure that everybody in our staff knows we are going to be working in dismantling systems of oppression. And that needs to be at the top of the agenda, working with our board in education. So I think along with reimagining how does our work out in the community look, it's really also about centering what is the deep culture work that's happening within our organization, both at the staff and the board level. So that's just a little bit about our journey right now. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I wanted to give the panelists to reflect on anything one of their partners might have said before we move into a next round of questions. So anything that just sort of sparked for you as you were listening to each other that you might want to share? Okay, well, I wanted to move into talking about the culture of philanthropy. And I think, Marisa, you started to lift that up, right? And we've heard from Henry around some of the things that you all are trying to do in terms of looking at these different systems, right? And Gabrielle, in terms of what you're doing to hopefully provide insights to this work. And so when we think about what it actually means to do that work of shifting some of the culture of philanthropy, I wanted to ask Henry, you know, what does it mean and what does it look like when you center the communities that you're funding and really trust that they know what they need? What does that look like for you as a funder and for your foundation?
Thanks, Alicia. So with the McCune Foundation, I mean, there's like technical ways that we do that. So for example, in our when we get our applications in, so we have the McCune Foundation has an annual open cycle, and we receive between 400 and 500 applications statewide every year, and then we go through and we have readers that read them, and we sort of score them based on different things. So one of the things that we focus on is community voice, and community in general, in terms of what evidence do we see in the application of the leadership being connected to the community, who are the folks that are really being served by the work. Most importantly, on that note, how was the program developed based on input and feedback from the community? What's the reciprocity between the organization and the community in terms of those conversations, and how does that shape it? So we're looking for that. We're also, and then beyond that, we, you know, I'm kind of hesitating because I feel like this is just such a challenging sort of nut to crack in terms of an individual foundation and how it goes about it. Like, for example, all 4 of our full-time employees at our foundation are New Mexicans, you know, whose families have been here for generations, you know, but we still have power that the nonprofits don't, you know. So is it enough that we're all, I think this is to what Hakeem's point in the chat was really talking about, you know, just because the face might be different, you know, it's still not necessarily the community that's making decisions. So it's just super challenging, I think, for individual foundations to figure that out. I think the Conalma Foundation has for a long time worked with community panels, you know, so there's different approaches in terms of how you shift the decision making. But to sound like a broken record, you know, I think for us, going back to the idea of structures, and again, this zone grant concept, what it's allowed us to do is allowed funders to pool funds and then allow community to make decisions about those funds. So you can see that it's abstracting the complexity of the decision making, because our board, we had to convince our board to say yes to put the money into the pooled fund. So that wasn't different. That's who usually makes the decisions at our foundation. But once the money got into this pool, from there, you know, we've worked super hard to create mechanisms by which community leaders would be in a position to actually make decisions, and not just make decisions, but again, when you talk about centering community voice, this particular fund, the Native American Recovery Fund, even in the process of putting together the RFP that was going to solicit proposals from Native-led organizations, we really reflected on the fact that we had to make sure that Native community leaders were involved in the drafting of the questions. you know. So I think in the video there was again a woman who made a point about the fact that, you know, the number of, you know, strategies developed inside foundations that change the world is 0, right? So, you know, we did a first iteration of the zone grant where the funders that were contributing and participating wrote the questions, but we, you know, in kind of reflection of like, no, you know, we have to make sure that the questions, not just so that the content in terms of what we're asking to be achieved or what the goals might be of the grants are, but even the language that's being used needs to be from the community. And then from there, you know, so questions are drafted by the community. We had, and then we had, it was actually the other cool thing about creating structures like this is it allows funders to take risks, you know, and that was another point that was made in, you know, Gabrielle made that point earlier, it was made in the video. How do you put philanthropy in a position to take the risks, you know, and even if they're afraid to do it. So we had these strategy tables that consisted of Native leaders and the funders who put money into the pools, who read the proposals together. And Gabrielle and I participated in a lot of those conversations, and it was super inspiring to see without any exception, the funders always deferred to the Native American leaders in the room around the table whenever it came down to it. I think that that's what we have to be creative. You know, we have to organize ourselves as funders, and we have to be creative about finding ways to always continually put community at the center, even if our own institution and organization isn't ready to go that far.
Thank you for sharing about that work, Henry. And I've been hearing about the zone grant work and the Native American recovery grant that you all did. So I'm glad that you were able to share, what it took to get to that. And it sounds like, a huge effort, right? It's like, making something from scratch. You can go make your pozole for like your dinner, your tamales, and you gotta have everything there. And then, hopefully it comes out good in the end. I know it didn't come without challenges though, so I appreciate you sharing that. And Gabrielle, I wanted to ask you, since you were part of that work as well, what have you seen that has worked to address those barriers, right? Henry shared some of what worked in terms of the strategy tables, having, the community members engaged. But when you think about, the different times that you come up to a big shift or a change, and there's either pushback or disagreement or risk aversion, what are you seeing that is working to be able to create systems that then are grantee focused and community based?
So I'll start with this idea of what do we mean when we say community. One thing that I've noticed both in like my past life as a executive director, running a community-based organization, and like now working within philanthropy, not as someone who has access to pots of money, but who's facilitating conversations, is like, what do we really mean when we say that? I think sometimes the easy thing to do is to invite anyone, whoever shows up to the table, to help define what we're doing. And I think it takes a little more work to really understand like the nuance within what it means to listen to and follow the lead of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in general, and then also like the nuances within that. So I think one of the learnings that I'm eager to see and like really respond to, being part of the zone grant work with the Native American Recovery Fund, is like even within New Mexico, how do we start to understand the nuanced needs of the different pueblos and tribes in New Mexico? Not a monolith, right? I think also within that, when we say people of color, like who are we leaving out? Because I work for a national organization, there's this interesting back and forth within the regions about like people of color means showing up for Black people first. Well, I think in New Mexico, sometimes we invisibilize our Black population. So I think we can do more to say like, who are the Black leaders? Where's the Black movement building? How do we invite them to the table? Like not wait for them to come to us with a grant application, right? Or to be a part of a project, but really how are we showing up for them in a generous and authentic way that is, deferential, which I have seen that attitude in the zone grant work, and it gives me a lot of hope. Same with Indigenous communities. I I think also like really understanding what intersectional identities mean. And I'm still learning like the appropriate use of that word, but like maybe the most impacted group are specifically like young Black mothers by a certain system, and how are they leading the movements or the programs that we want to fund as funders. The other thing I was thinking about today, because we had a webinar at AFN, Marisa Bono, who I think did some work in New Mexico before moving to Texas to run an organization there, was talking about the 5 elements of power building. And so she talked about people power, narrative power, relationship power, governance power, and financial power. And I think philanthropy really needs to understand what its lane is, and then maybe stay in that lane as much as we can. And for me, it's like, okay, we have a lot of power with money, so the financial power piece, and then also the narrative power piece, and really thinking about, as funders, when we're talking about supporting Black and Brown movement leaders and policy initiatives that make their lives better and more dignified, that there's not this like zero-sum narrative. Really inspired by this author, Heather McGhee. Some of you have probably read the book, The Sum of Us. I'm a big geek about it, but it makes the case for how good policy for all people, white folks included, comes through collective action. And so really curious about, as funders, how we're not perpetuating this like scarcity mentality, not just between groups of color, but even between like white folks who are disenfranchised by the same systems that are oppressing Black and Brown people, and how we start to shift that narrative while also centering POC leadership, while also relinquishing power. So I think it's really complex, but I see in New Mexico that it's happening in like a really authentic and heart-centered way. You know, participating with Marisa and Henry in the zone grant work has been like, it gives me a lot of hope, because I think that this work at its core should be heart-centered. Strategy matters, but like really caring about people matters just as much. And there's a lot of heart, I think, coming from our funders that I haven't seen before. And I don't know if that's just me because I'm new to the sector, and I'm curious if it's just my fresh eyes or if that's a new phenomenon, but I say more of it because, you know, that's what we need in doing this work to make real change and lasting change. So thanks, Alicia.
I absolutely agree with the heart-centered approach. And I think when we were on our call a few days ago to prepare for this webinar, Gabrielle, I think you were the one that you know, talked about the healing work that needs to happen within our communities in a place like New Mexico, right? With the tricultural myth, and I'm seeing some chatter over here in the chat about, you know, about this, and about also how we can sort of individualize ourselves and disappear others, right? And then the power dynamics that happen even in a place like New Mexico that is, you know, a majority people of color state, that there's still lots of struggles and still lots of work that we can do around equity and lifting each other up. So I really appreciate that. I say yes, more heart. I wanted to ask you, Marisa, about, you know, being a woman of color in this world of philanthropy, and, you know, how that has shaped your philosophy as it comes to doing this work in philanthropy and within community.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big one. You know, I think, oh gosh, I think what I would want to say first is, you know, it really starts with heart, again, like what we're saying, in relationships and transformational relationships. We hear a lot about that, like how do we go from transactional relationships to transformational relationships? And I think that, you know, thinking about my path into philanthropy, coming from an organization who rarely got funded by the organization I work for now, is certainly like why would that happen? And, bringing that experience in and saying, if we had those barriers, other people had those barriers, and hearing about them now. And so really coming to the work with like deep care and concern for how this community foundation can serve its community that it belongs to, right? So I think about that a lot. And then I really think about, again, like going back to the internal work, our staff has changed a lot over the last 2 years. And so I know all of us on the team are really concerned to say, well, we can create a more diverse staff, but what does it mean to really support people of color in philanthropy, women of color in philanthropy? And so I think about, how many of us on this call have been in meetings where you're sitting there and you're like, your throat chakra is really burning, saying like, I got to say this, like if I don't say it, I got to say it, right? And so how do we create environments where people can speak their full truth and feel supported and not feel like they're going to be fired in the next week because, a board member didn't like what they were saying? And that's a real situation, right? When we're coming into historically white organizations and a historically white sector, we have to, I think, hold on deeply and tightly to each other and build those communities to support not only within our organization, but within our sector. So that's a little bit about, I think, what the experience has been like for me and then how I try to approach the work, especially with our team at the foundation.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know that feeling of wanting to say something and all the ramifications if you do. What might that be, right? And so, yeah, I think how do we support each other in those spaces and create those opportunities for more of that. So thank you. Adrián, I wanted to ask, you as you kind of think about the place that you're in and what it's taken for you to move along this journey doing social enterprise and movement building work. If you could give some thoughts on what efforts foundations could make to influence their peers, right? So that you don't have a McCune Foundation out there, like Henry said, trying to figure out how to shift these massive systems, and these smaller foundations or institutions. What do you think should be part of the efforts to sort of shift and influence their peers?
Yeah, we'll definitely do more of what we've been hearing, right, from Marisa, Henry, and Gabrielle. I think it's really, they're putting forth a model that is working, right, of influencing their peers in philanthropy. I would add that it really is important that things like what we saw, for example, with the New Mexico Impact Investment Collaborative that I know a lot of folks on this panel were a part of. We're really seeing how philanthropy can come together and talk about potential projects, right, with them in the room and strategize about where different funders can sort of focus, right, their priorities, their funding priorities to like support a project and really almost think of that ecosystem we've been talking about and how each funder's specific interests can help meet the needs and together, right, as a collective, make a project whole. The discussion that's been talking about that Hakeem put in there about really bringing in also public, right, leveraging public dollars, right, and how philanthropy can also build and reach out, build relationships with our public sector, right, for to ensure sustained, right, funding efforts and sustained really missions, because a lot of times is like philanthropy wants an exit at some point, right? It's like, okay, we can do this for 5 years, 10 years. But at some point, right, it's we need to look at our public sector and really, on that systems level change, making that significant investment like what we're seeing in early childhood development and education, right? The long investment that philanthropy has made, we're all looking forward to, to seeing that systemic investment that the state's been making, and that will, then translate into hopefully the victory of this ballot initiative, right, for this constitutional amendment. So it's that type of really, I think, of influencing within a peer community, but also looking even, external, right, and bringing in new philanthropic partners, public partners. Something I want to, something that at least on our side, right, that we often, or that's can be frustrating is, in moving kind of money and kind of influencing peers is also understanding that, that it's important to have quick, sometimes quick no's, right? You know, there's nothing more frustrating sort of on the community side than to kind of sort of be drug along a process, right? You know, a year, 2 years of sort of due diligence and sort of this relationship building and understanding, and then to get a delayed no when maybe early on there was an idea that funding wasn't going to happen. So within sort of those peer discussions, really understanding that, hey, it might not be a good match, and that's okay, right? It's like as a leader of nonprofits, having done this work over the years, I'd much rather know upfront, right, that hey, this is not it's not a funding priority, and that's okay. We appreciate the quick no, and we also appreciate the quick yeses. But I think there's again, I think this panel is sort of a model on how we can ensure that foundations are influencing each other to really fund the work that that is needed, right, to shift systems. One more thing I just want to say is really funding also, and sort of as foundations talk amongst peers to really understand that we might fund gaps, right? And so a lot of our work, right, we realize that we might not have, right, everything that we need in order to move money for a specific project or a specific campaign, and understanding that philanthropy can really play a big role in leveraging, right, resources with consultants, right, with financial advisors, with developers to really help to fund specific capacity, right, that might not even go directly to the organization, right, but that could go in order to be able to make and fill a gap that we might see within a project or campaign. So that's kind of what comes to mind.
I think you've started a couple of sayings here, Adrián. There's going to be the quick no and the quick yes. And we're just going to know what that means. Everyone wants the quick yes. But if you're not going to get the quick yes, give us the quick no. So before we open it up to Q&A, we've got a few questions lined up from folks that have submitted them in our Q&A function. Folks, feel free to drop something in the chat if there's something that that you'd like to ask any of our panelists. Feel free. But before we go to that, I wanted to just sort of open it up to our panelists to share, their thoughts on other ways that we can address, the leadership gaps that do exist within foundations and philanthropy for people of color, and for folks like yourself sitting here around the table. What comes up for you? What have you seen worked, and what is something you might like to try within your own organization? And Adrián, feel free to weigh in as well, even within your work as movement and having done such deep work with funders over the years. And maybe, Gabrielle, I'll start with you if you have some thoughts to share on that. I know we spoke a little bit ahead of time about this also. In terms of your thoughts.
The leadership gap within philanthropy as a sector, or, sorry.
Yeah, I would say like the leadership gaps that you see within philanthropy as a sector when it comes to people of color and women of color.
So this is a really interesting thing, and it's new in my life, but I get a lot of phone calls from foundations nationally asking who I know who I can refer to jobs. And I don't always know what to do with that, because I know some spaces aren't safe. And so on one hand, I think it makes a big difference, right, to have not just a person of color or a woman of color in a position of decision-making power, but also someone with nonprofit experience. I think I vibe with Marisa in like this, we both arts organizations, right? Women of color, like talk about having it's very difficult raising money for something that a lot of funders may not see as essential, right? And we had key allies to raise money for our arts organizations. Add social justice to the mix and whoa, really hard to raise money. So like program officers with that kind of experience, like, wow, they get how hard it is. And like, are they ready for this person? Like, are they ready for her? Are they ready for them? Like, can they show up as their full authentic selves? And so highlighting what Marisa said, right? The internal, external work, like how are we doing both of those things to get ourselves ready for the really radical people to be in positions of power and to be doing things like the way, you know, Henry's doing things at McCune or Marisa is starting to, you know, support a shift at ACF. And I think also when I think about this, like I have a stomach for that stuff. Like I can really like go hard or bite my tongue, and like I've worked on not getting my feelings hurt. Like I don't want to take abuse, right? But like I've learned that I have a stomach for that kind of stuff. And so I also have a like proximity to whiteness and also certain privileges in terms of education and experience that like maybe make me seen and heard in ways that others might not. So like, what is my responsibility in starting to not just shift culture, but to like institute it through policy change when I have the opportunity in organizations. So yeah, like how do we make it safe for people of color to be in these positions of power, and how do we set it in stone through policy within those institutions internally? So I think that's what your question was asking. I hope I answered it.
Absolutely. You know, and again, this is, you know, a time for us, I think, to think broadly and expansively about what could be, and at the same time sort of share our experiences, right? And share your experiences as to what you've seen and you know, what has worked or what has not worked. So I appreciate that perspective. And just the thought that you would have to think about, well, okay, I'm not going to recommend this person. I don't know that they're going to be in a safe space. I think that you're probably not the only one that shares that experience. Henry, I wanted to ask you, you know, because this was referenced earlier from Gabrielle about the amount of work that went into really sort of building the solidarity and the work around the zone grant. And so when you think about what solidarity looks like in a place like New Mexico amongst people of color, you know, what have you seen aside from what you're doing with building these coalitions for the zone grant? Like what does it look like for you in New Mexico, and how can we do it even better, right, in those authentic ways that have been mentioned earlier today?
I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is just communication, trust, and relationship. I think that has been, and I think Adrián talked about this earlier. That was, so I think the one of the heaviest lifts for the recovery fund was just getting the funders on board, and the challenge, you know, some were very easy, but it's really like the willingness to go and like repeat yourself like 1,000 times, you know, to go and talk to, I think our challenge is everybody is so busy. And I think there's an impulse that we can't make decisions or we can't move forward unless we have everybody involved in the conversation. And then we look at our calendars and say, okay, well, we can meet in August. You know what I mean? That's the next time we can all get together and talk about things. And I see that in the philanthropic world quite a bit, you know, because we want to make sure that that everybody, that all the right people are in the room. So the only other way to do it is to just put yourself in the position of being the connector and just being willing to kind of go through. And if there was 10 people you wanted at the meeting and only 3 people could be there, of going through and spending that extra 7 hours, you know, 1 hour with each of those people that weren't there and sharing the recording with them and answering their questions and getting their ideas and then bringing it back. And so I think that the thing that's been the most risk-taking in terms of the work that I've been doing is the funders willing to kind of not stick with timelines. So the work has really been to say, we understand that our sort of practice as funders is to make schedules and to stick with the schedules and do these things and keep track of that stuff. But but kind of the understanding that we can't really do something transformational unless we trust each other. And we can't do that unless we're confident that we're getting all the right information and that our voices are being heard. If we don't do that and we don't do that hard work and take the time to do that, when it comes time to ask them for a check, they're not going to be as quick to do it. So that's what I've seen in terms of looking at the nonprofit partners that I've worked closest with, has been, I think, the thing that characterizes them all more than anything else is all about relationship and trust and communication and taking time to make sure the relationships are right before deciding what the next step is going to be.
Yeah, and I appreciate you coming back to that, because I know at the very beginning, right, when Adrián was talking about his work, he kept talking about the relationships that had to be built over long periods of time. And, I wanted to ask Marisa, because, it was something that we had talked about as well, because not only are you representing this foundation and working with the grantees and the folks that you're funding, but then you have your donors, right? The folks that are making your foundation possible. So, how are you, or how could you be working with donors, right? When you think about how you might move funding towards movement building work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a critical space for us to be in, and I want to name and just recognize how much power donors traditionally hold, donors at the community foundation, donors to any organization. Again, coming from nonprofit, I experienced that a lot in my early parts of my career. And I think that, it starts with education and being willing to name that power, know that it is operating all the time. And and Gabrielle brought up community-centric fundraising, and I think that's a really important place to start, and thinking about how do we redistribute the power when it comes to donors and grantees. And in this case, thinking about the access to the community foundation has to many, many donors with lots of interest, lots of, wealth and backgrounds. And I think that it's imperative for us to be having those conversations with donors about trust-based practices, about the need for multi-year funding, about, funding coalition work. And so all of those things, and I would say that we're just at the beginning of that journey, right? And looking at how do we build partnerships with donors where there's a lot of alignment, and also recognizing that at this point at the community foundations, or moments, there are points where there's, donors where we're just a very transactional entity, right? We facilitate grant making, but I think our goal is, just like we're looking at having those transformational relationships with CBOs, community-based organizations in the community, it's also, really imperative that we develop them with the donors. And again, I just can't stress enough about naming the power dynamics that exist there. So I would also say that, what's interesting, and somebody pulled it up in the Q&A around like what other collaborations are happening, and we're working also deeply with United Way in a lot of different ways. And I think it's been really interesting to see both organizations figuring out how trust-based philanthropy is pervasive in all of our grant making vehicles, whether we're working with donors or discretionary funds or programs or anything like that. And so it's been great to have a learning partner together to figure out how are we talking to donors, and it's nice that we're both doing it and really sharing that information between each agency to say these are conversations that must be happening with donors.
Thank you, Marisa. I'm seeing a question in the chat that I wanted to put out. Maybe Gabrielle or Henry wanted to take a look at that. But there's a question here, right? How can the process be more nimble / agile, yet still meet philanthropy's capacity and need for accountability?
Gabrielle?
I have a simple one, and I think, Henry, you'll be better at going into the details. But one of the things we've been saying at Asset Funders Network is whose rules would we be breaking? Our own. So why don't we just change them? Accountability is such a funny thing to me. We can break our own rules, we can change our own rules. And also where does accountability lie for the deepest impact? Is it with our donors or our board who have this big pile of money to spend? Or is it at the people who we're trying to serve through our missions, the people who are closest, like the Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley quote, right? Closest to the pain should be closest to the power. Like, our accountability should also lie with them. And whose rules do we have to break to change them? Like, to me, it's ours, and I don't have to work with a family foundation board. So it's easy for me to stay. Like, I'll fully acknowledge that. That's all I have to say about that one.
What I'll add is I feel like I don't think there's an easy way a quick, easy way to kind of make a shift in philanthropy, because I think that when there's crisis, philanthropy is good at moving money fast to the extent that it does do that. But when it's about systems change, it's not good at doing that. So I think if we're thinking, there's foundations which comprise a certain percentage of philanthropy, which I think is a pretty small percentage, that are kind of aligned with systems change and they can move money fast. But if you think of this full scope of philanthropy, it's not going to move that fast. And so I wish there was a better answer, but I think it's about culture change. If you just consider that, like, for example, like a private family foundation is only legally obligated to disperse 5% of its endowment every year. So like the McCune Foundation, we have $100 million in our investment portfolio, but we only by law have to put out 5% of that. That is such a tiny amount for us to be putting out. To think about what kind of change could happen if we were able to put out more of that. But our board doesn't, is committed to perpetuity. And so therefore they stick with that 5%, and the vast majority of foundations do. So when you think about the scope of the change that has to happen in philanthropy for it to be able to be nimble and agile to quickly move money to social change work, it's a huge, heavy lift. And so from my perspective, it's about culture change, and it's about really pushing hard to make a difference in the longer term.
Could I just hop in on that?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I just was thinking, there's a lot of some funders on the call, all of us here, we talk about this inside the foundation, a lot of everything that we adapted during COVID, moved everything to unrestricted, ease reporting, all the stuff. And so I know one of the things that we're doing at ACF is saying that's just best practice. And we did it. And we need to stop saying we did it. I mean, we did do it in response to COVID, but now we know that's the best practice, and we need to just keep those processes in place. And really, again, taking the community input on that, which is right there, and then bringing that in front of our board and saying, this is why this is critical, right? And so I just think, the pandemic really did, I think, shift a lot of things for a lot of funders very quickly. And so why go back? And let's help each other, like use good internal peer pressure to say, like, well, they're not going back and they're not going back, so let's not go back either.
Along with the question earlier, right? How do you influence your peers? So that might be one way, right? In terms of culture shift. There was a comment in the chat from Christopher. Makes me think about funding from government as well, federal, state, county, and city. Oops, it's going away. Okay. And how we get them to fund movement building and not just presenting problems, right? So thinking about the COVID funds that weren't used to address this stuff. And I know, Adrián, you started to lift this up a little bit earlier, thinking about the land grant fund and the way that public earned revenue or public funding can be used as part of this. What are your thoughts on this conversation at this point, and what could be done?
I mean, that's just so key. I've really come to believe that as a sector, we really need to develop diverse, funding portfolios and sources, right? That includes, earned revenue, services, professional services that we provide, programmatic services, selling of services and products as a nonprofit, right? As a nonprofit, we all know it does not mean that you're not making revenue, right? It means that you're using it, in service of mission, not distributing to stakeholders, right? But I think that we don't challenge ourselves enough as a sector, and maybe even philanthropy. I think we're doing better at that, where we are looking at ways to really go to government sources, and there are a lot of examples, right, that we're seeing now currently of philanthropy working with community-based organizations and government, right? And we have a lot of allies in government, right, where we're now saying, hey, we're making this initial investment, we're going to pilot, we're going to run an experiment, see if this works, and then we're going to ask public dollars to kick in and to match or to to find a funding source. Earned revenue, I think, is important for us to continuously think about, right? How we can make sure that our organizations and our movements are around for 20, 30, 50, 100 plus years, right? And I think that when we think of social enterprise and the opportunity right there, I think we do a lot of things better than the for-profit sector, and I think that there's not a problem with monetizing some of the things that we do well, and leveraging that to reinvest in movements, right, and people and social capital, and shifting systems. So it's the recycling, right, the redistribution of wealth and money, and to put it back towards movement and transformational change. So I love when we think creatively about how to do that, and I think there's a lot of creative thinkers that I certainly have seen put this to work here on this panel and on the participant list. Oh, you're on mute, Alicia. I'll be the one that says that famously.
Thank you, Adrián. Were there any other thoughts on that before I, yeah, go ahead, Marisa.
So we're working with the state of New Mexico, the Department for Finance Administration right now to administer a housing stability program, and it comes under the umbrella of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And it's all service dollars, and in our conversations across the state, it's like there's incredible coalitions around organizing to deal with housing instability and just the housing crisis overall. And so I won't say that in this particular funding we're trying to do really innovative things and figure out how to fund coalition building. But one of the things I just wanted to point out is it's really forcing us to think about activating all the other levers, because we see the restrictions on this being, very strictly service reimbursement basis money. And so then we're thinking, okay, well, how do we get impact investments to provide cash flow loan funds, or how do we leverage philanthropy to come in and say, okay, let's bring in unrestricted dollars to this coalition. We've got the service money over here. So we're really trying to think about how do we deploy and press all the different levers that we have access to make the federal funding that we're dealing with, which is more restrictive, just more successful. And so that's some of the work that we're in right now.
Awesome, thank you for that. Having the four of you here on this panel today, I think someone said it earlier, right, gives me hope, right, in terms of what we can do to really start shifting how we think about this. And I'm really grateful for you all giving your time to talk about this. I wanted to share some resources again, Catherine, on the Move the Money for people. We're going to put up a slide just to sort of refresh your memory on what that looks like and how you can use it within your own organizations. So again, the Move the Money, it's a set of resources to enable foundations to support movements and their leaders. It builds on ongoing work to bring about shifts in philanthropy, and it offers 4 thematic videos and guides with recommendations, examples, and reflection questions, as well as providing various ways to learn, apply, and utilize the resources. So these are there for you all. And I think what we've heard today, for me, I'm seeing a lot of this work in action with what you all have shared. Before we wrap up today, I want to open it up to the folks that are still joining us. If there's any last burning questions that you want to ask before I turn it over to our panelists for some closing thoughts. And Catherine has just shared in the chat again the link to the Move the Money toolkit. So it's there in your chat. You can click on it and go check out those videos and download the guides. Again, they have reflections and questions that you can use within your own organizations. So I wanted to turn it over to our panelists to share any last thoughts that you might have, and I'll go ahead and start with Marisa.
Thanks. I guess it really is just a question I think about a lot, and I referenced it earlier, which is, this community foundation belongs to the community. It's built by and for the community. And so what does this community need from its foundation? Kind of jumbled that, but what does this community need from its foundation?
Thank you. Henry, let me go to you for any last thoughts or closing words.
I guess the thought I was thinking about here, trying to think of what my closing thought would be to encourage all of you when you're meeting with your funders to ask them what other funders they collaborate with. So I'm sure they always ask you about what other nonprofits you collaborate with, and so suggest that you also ask them who they collaborate with in terms of foundations.
Excellent point. Thank you. Gabrielle, anything you want to share?
Yeah, I want to shout out Chris Ramirez because he really sparked some thinking during this for me with one of his questions and comments. So I'm really curious about how philanthropy can ask itself, how do we center truth and be reparative in how we do our grant making? I think that could be a really powerful question for us collectively in philanthropy.
Thank you for that. It makes me think that could be a whole other webinar, right? Around, you talked earlier about the healing work that needs to happen and the reparations and what that might look like. So thank you for lifting that up. Adrián, I'm going to turn it over to you to share any thoughts or last words you might want.
Yeah, I think just that, obviously, I'm in a relationship with a lot of people on this, panel and participant list. And, I guess, I feel extremely privileged to be in this work, right? And I do feel hopeful because I think that a lot of, the faces that I see here in the conversation we're having is really about the basics, right? About the hard work, about investing in people, investing in proximate and local leadership, and the wisdom of our community and the wisdom of families. And I think, as long as we keep doing the work together and commit to this as we've done over the years, I'm hopeful that of the future of this state and nationally. I'd love to see that a lot of folks here are now, connected and really elevating the work that's happening in New Mexico as a model, because I truly believe we are a model for the rest of the country.
Thank you all. And Adrián, I really want to second that. It makes, as I was looking at you all and then looking at the names that were in the list who joined us, I mean, there's lots of familiar faces, people with long relationships, 20 years, some, I've worked with some of you all for a very long time. And to see the growth and to see what's happening in New Mexico, I feel like we often are at the forefront of looking at things differently and being able to offer some solutions nationally. And, there was always this debate back in the day about New Mexico sort of being this poor stepchild, and folks would come in and throw money at us and tell us what to do and then leave, right? And there's been a shift around how that work is done, and the leadership in New Mexico standing up and saying, actually, we deserve more. We want to be partners in this work. We have the answers and we know what works for us, for our people in our communities. And so the work that you all are doing has really set the stage for that. So I'm really grateful for your work and your insight. To everyone who joined us today, really grateful for your time. Again, go to buildingmovementproject.org. There's a lot of resources there. And with that, I'm going to thank you all and sign off of our webinar. So thank you for joining.